This is Jesse Zurawell and Perspective on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome to Perspective. I am Jesse Zurawell, your host for the hour, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cynthia Chung. Cynthia is a lecturer, writer, and co-founder and editor of the Rising Tide Foundation. She publishes frequently at the Strategic Culture Foundation and also at her Substack, which is cynthiachung.substack.com. And last week, she published an excellent piece with Strategic Culture titled How the Ukrainian Nationalist Movement Post-World War II Was Bought and Paid For by the CIA. And it's a very intensive, very thoroughly documented piece that provides a deep history of not just Ukrainian nationalism, but how that morphed into outright Nazism of the sort that we are seeing manifested today via groups like the Azov Battalion, the Pravi Sector, and other entities in Ukraine who are really the holdouts, the last holdouts of the fight against Russia in Ukraine. They're holed up in Azovstal in Mariupol. It's a giant industrial facility that apparently goes multiple stories underground, and they are cornered there, but ready to fight to the death. And we should make no bones about it. These are literal Nazis. And here, thankfully, to provide some historical context to that is Cynthia Chung. Cynthia, welcome to Perspective. Thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I think a good place to start, I've outlined in a past show with journalist Alex Rubinstein the groups, the Nazi groups that are at present fighting in Ukraine. So I really want to dig into the history that led up to that, which obviously you've done an excellent job detailing in this latest piece for Strategic Culture. But I think a good place to start would be a brief explanation of Kievan Rus, and then perhaps after that, a detailing of the Cossack-Polish War in the 17th century, and Khmelnytsky, who it seems became the first sort of Ukrainian nationalist hero, because it seems like that's the seed, if you will, of the nationalism or Nazism that we're seeing at work today in Ukraine. So perhaps we can start there.
Sure. I'm not an expert myself on this history. I did the research to basically answer questions that I had as well, but I'll do my best since I don't really know too much about the Khmelnytsky uprising. But one thing that is very important for understanding what's going on in Ukraine today is the Kievan Rus kingdom, which, you know, the golden age was about 1,000 years ago. And the Kievan Rus was started by the Rurik dynasty, and they basically ruled for the entire time that this existed until the Mongols came and around the 1200s, mid-1200s. And Kievan Rus still existed, but they were split up into three sections, which was the Kingdom Galicia Volhynia, which is today Ukraine and Belarus for the most part, the Novgorod Republic, which is parts of Finland and Russia, and the Vladimir Suzdal, which was became the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which was the the bedrock of what became the Russian culture and language. So the kingdom Galicia-Volhynia is what I focus on, obviously, for the Ukraine history. And in 1349, Galicia-Volhynia is conquered by Poland. Poland and Lithuania were very big powers at the time. And in 1569, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is formed. So this is the entire time that the section that's Ukraine is under this. And it's important to note that, the region of Ukraine never existed as Ukraine, as not the word nor the region that we think of today.
Right.
And so they were for ever since the Kievan Rus time period, they've been, for the most part, under the rule of Polish, mainly the Polish. So then in the mid-1600s, you have the Khmelnytsky uprising, which formed the Cossack hetmanate, for Ukraine. And as you said, this really formed the seed, I guess you could say, for Ukrainian nationalism. And there was not a very loving rule by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And what the Cossacks are kind of romanticized in this period, because it was viewed that they kind of gave the region its independence, which they felt like they hadn't had for like a good 400 years or so. But the thing is that they had also kind of purged all Polish-Lithuanian citizens, like exterminated them. They exterminated the Catholic clergy and the Jews. And so that was kind of a role model, unfortunately, for a lot of the ideology for what would form the Ukrainian nationalist movement later on. Eventually, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not able to rule itself in the late 1700s, and they were split up between the Habsburg monarchy, which was the Austrian Empire, later on to become the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867, the Russian Empire, and the Kingdom of Prussia. And it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that took Galicia, and they also call it Lodomeria, which is strange because apparently that region doesn't exist. But anyway, they called it Galicia Lodomeria. And most of Volhynia went to the Russian Empire. So again, one of the problems is that the pre-nationalist historians in the 20th century, they started to, and you see this out actually with Chrystia Freeland's uncle too, who is a historian for, I believe it's the University of Alberta, but he's a professor in Alberta for one of the I would imagine it's only the University of Alberta there. But there's this form of history that started to form then, which you see with the Ukrainian nationalists today. They continue to promote this, which is that it is only the Galicians who, when the Kievan Rus kingdom was split into three, the Galicians were the only ones who truly continued the Rurik dynasty bloodline, and that it wasn't continued with the other kingdoms. And so they deny the Russians, which was the Vladimir Suzdal branch, which also had a branch of the Rurik dynasty. So they all had branches of the Rurik dynasty that took over the three different sections. But the Galicians, which today are like the Western Ukrainians, they deny this as valid. And so Galicia, for the most part, was under Polish rule. And later on, when we talk about the OUN formation and all this was when they were under the rule of the Polish. So there was a real disconnect between them and Russia, but they were also disconnected with what is today Eastern Ukraine, or like a huge chunk actually of Ukraine. They were in their own kind of world, so to speak. So after this happens with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth being split into three, I just skip forward to World War One, and important to note that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed by the Russians in 1918 because they couldn't continue fighting the Germans, even though the war would end a few months later, and they relinquished several countries in like Eastern Europe, and they were supposed to be, like, some people say that they're supposed to be given their independence, but in reality, they were going to be German vassal states. But then Germany ended up losing the war. So there was a kind of, free for all in some ways for a lot of these Eastern European countries, and Poland and Ukraine very much wanted to vie for independence. And Poland and Ukraine at the time were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Sorry if this is confusing for people, especially with no maps. But
no, you're doing an excellent job laying it out.
So they at this point, the Polish also had Galicia for a while. So the Polish also felt like, no, Galicia is ours. And, as soon as you have this opening, because, you didn't have the Russian Empire that existed anymore, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire fell, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire no longer existed. So Poland and Ukraine, they go to war. From November 1918 to July 1919, and Poland wins and they reoccupy Galicia. And then you also have Polish-Soviet War, February 1919 to March 1921. And in between all of this, you have several mini wars, which is not very well organized. You can't really say there's like a clear party that the Ukrainian people are choosing, but there's a Ukrainian War of Independence, which is not, it's really several wars that are being fought. There's a lot of infighting between 1917 and 1921. So eventually by 1922, so it's a very, like, everything is, transferring quite a bit during this period. By 1922, Ukraine, which again, it's never been independent, right? Really, in its entire history, it's divided. But the region that we call Ukraine was divided between the Ukrainian SSR, Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. And Lviv, Galicia, and most of Volhynia go to Poland, and the small part of Volhynia goes to the USSR. So now we're at a point, unless you want to say something, where we get into the OUN.
Sure. I just want to add that it's really fundamental to, or really critical to point out what you just said a moment ago about the fact that there never has been either a distinct territorial entity of Ukraine, and thus there's never been a distinct national identity. But as you just so well outlined, there have been many who've sought both simultaneously for centuries. And in my mind, we're seeing that that striving for a national identity. In the case of the Nazis currently at work in Ukraine, this pure Ukrainian national identity, and also a territorial identity as well, which if you get into the work of Olena Semeniaka, for example, has some very interesting ideas about what should constitute the territory of Ukraine and the surrounding nation states. But it's important for people to know that, because that ideology is at the heart of what the holdouts I mentioned at the beginning are fighting for. They really do believe in this ideology, and they are psychotic about it. So it's again important that people know that, and that this has centuries-long roots, even millennia deep roots. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that point. But as you said, in 1929, we get the OUN, or Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So perhaps you can explain the formation of that entity, which is still very relevant today.
Right. And I just wanted to mention, actually, I forgot to talk about the Trident, which is relevant to the. So for myself included, like, there was a recent scandal with Britain. They had something like a list of terrorist organizations or symbols and such. And one of the things included on this was the Ukrainian Trident. And it caused a lot of controversy, because it's, the official coat of arms of Ukraine since 1991, since they had independence from the Soviet Union when it dissolved.
Right.
And I was always a little bit confused about that, because at the same time you see it on these, so-called, which when you look into it, they are Nazis in Ukraine. It's all over their flags, their emblems and everything. So what is going on here? Is there a legitimacy to this or what? And so it turns out that the first Ukrainian to, it seems, that we have on record using the Trident is from 1,000 years ago, during the golden age of Kievan Rus, and it was with Vladimir or Volodymyr, who was apparently a great ruler. I don't know the details at all of him. And so it's like in some ways, a romanticized reference point for them to return to this golden age where, and again, they identify with themselves really being the only representatives alive on Earth today who have the Rurik bloodlines. So they don't consider people from Belarus or from Russia to also share in this glory. And so unfortunately, the reason why it's a
foundational myth of denialism, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's just highly biased, I guess.
Well, denialism in the sense that they deny they deny that Belarusians or Russians are their brethren, which they are. They're Slavic brethren, and this is a matter of historical fact. But
interestingly, we're going to get a little bit more into that denial, in the sense that they thought that when Hitler said he was going to kill all Slav people, he wasn't talking about Ukrainians. But so for what was I saying, for the Trident, the OUN, they selected the Trident as their symbol, and they identified as a homogenous, purely Ukrainian ethnic race, and that the reason why Ukraine had been ruled constantly, been under the rule of different, empires and so forth, because, in 1929, East Galicia is in Poland, and that's where the OUN is formed. And Poland is not being very nice to them. There is a certain amount of oppression and censorship. And so the OUN has it in their perspective that if they were to return to a pure ethnic Ukrainian race, they would no longer be ruled by others, and they would be able, and this is very similar to the German Nazi ideology too. I think, like, especially hearing people who are supportive of Hitler, they speak in a very similar way to this. And so
yes, absolutely.
You have like two groupings. You have like the older members of the OUN that they actually were a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, military aspects and such as this. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire has more of a reputation of being much more lenient than the Polish rule that they're under by the time of 1929. And the younger members, which are mostly from Galicia, they are much more radical. They're much more violent. So there was always a little bit of a rift between the two generations. By 1934, the Polish Interior Minister, Browisław, sorry for my pronunciation, Pieracki, was assassinated by the OUN in 1936. Among the members who are found guilty of this are Stefan Bandera and Mikola Lebe. And they're convicted, they're put in prison, but they eventually escape in 1939 when the Germans invade. And these two are really the ones, the most prominent members of the OUN. By 1940, though, the differences between the generations become too intense, again, because the younger generation are just more impulsive and radical. So the OUN splits into the OUNM and the OUNB. The OUNM is run by Andrei Melnik, and the OUNB is by Stefan Bandera. So in 1930, yeah, go ahead.
If I can just jump in for a moment and add that Stepan Bandera, for those who don't know, is considered by the Nazi elements in Western Ukraine, especially, to be a national hero. And after the Maidan Putsch in 2014 and the installation of the puppet government by the US, there was an attempt to get a law passed to officially recognize Stepan Bandera as a national hero. I think that initially that effort met with success, but was repealed or just fell short of meeting with success. I'm not sure of the exact dynamics of that, but all of that to say that today, these elements that I referred to earlier, who are fighting as the last holdouts in Ukraine, they trace their lineage directly back to people. Some call him a Nazi collaborator. I say he was essentially a Nazi. People like Stepan Bandera, but I just wanted to add that quickly to give some present day context to who this person is and how influential he is.
Yeah, and Viktor Yushchenko during the Orange Revolution, when he ended up becoming president of Ukraine, he only served one term because his he ended up not being able to address any, because a lot of this stems from the economic issues of Ukraine. So, in the 1990s, when Ukraine had their so-called independence, which was really independence for the first time in their entire history, they were entirely unequipped to deal with what basically the floodgates were opened, and the IMF was now the new ruler of Ukraine in a very much a real way, and their GDP plummeted within a very short period of time. They used to be the breadbasket of Europe under the USSR, and all of a sudden you have Nazi groupings that are formed. A lot of them are being formed, by the mid 90s and later, but some even right away as soon as they get independence, which is, as I think my paper showcases why that is the case. It's definitely a Western encouragement for that. But a lot of radicalization, as it happens anywhere in the world, often stems to, economic oppression. If people feel that they don't have opportunity, if people feel that they don't have a future, this is when you tend to have the most, radical type of outfits that form. And so Viktor Yushchenko, his office was a failure. They were not able to do anything to make the economic situation for Ukrainians better. And, the Maidan revolution too is very much centered around economics, right, with the EU deal. But right before Yushchenko leaves, he actually calls, I say Stefan Bandera, not Stepan, because I've seen it spelled with an F as well, and I just say it that way. But he declares him a war hero for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Yushchenko was very clearly Western backed. Like his wife worked for the White House directly. I forgot the exact position she held, but she had a direct position in the White House. So they've been pushing this for a very long time, which will be evident once we get to the point of the CIA. But right.
Yeah. So I think this is a good place for us to take the break that we have to do mid-show here. But when we come back, yes, let's definitely pick up with the OUN. We left off with it fracturing into the OUNB and OUNM. But then when we come back, let's talk about how that morphed into collaboration with Nazis. And then, of course, we can get into the CIA really fostering these Nazi elements throughout much of the latter half of the 20th century, or all of the latter half, you could say. So more with Cynthia Chung after this.
You should hear what Misty Winston is talking about.
I want to actually talk a little bit about the class divide with you, because I think that, you just mentioned the class war, and we are in, I don't think people recognize it, we are in a class war and have been for some time. Like the middle class, the working class, we perhaps have been unaware of the fact that we're in a class war, but that's been going on for a long time. So let's talk a little bit about that and the class divide. Well, how do you see things right now? Because I feel like right now there's a lot of distractions being thrown our way to kind of prevent us from noticing the man behind the curtain.
Right. I think people really need to pay attention to what's going on economically in this country. And I don't just mean in reference to inflation. For example, I talked about this the other night. Bill Gates is actually buying farmland in the United States, a lot of farmland. And there was a woman that came on my show about 2 weeks ago, and she was telling me that Bill Gates is stealing water from her town.
Misty Winston on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Think tsunamis only happen somewhere else? Think again. Tsunamis happen when ocean water is displaced by an earthquake or other large undersea disturbance. Plan to act. If you are near the coast and feel a quake, hear the ocean roar, or see the water recede significantly, a tsunami may be approaching. Get moving. Go inland and up to safety. For more information, visit tsunami.gov.
Unlike other health concerns, mental illness is not always easy to see. Depression won't show up on an eye chart, and you won't find PTSD by looking at a thermometer. Sorting out a mental health concern takes professional diagnosis and treatment. Anxiety won't just go away under a bandage. If you or a loved one has a mental health concern, call 1-800-662-HELP for free and confidential information and treatment referral. Learn more at samhsa.gov/support.
Instead of putting a cracker under a politician, why not some TNT? Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to Perspective. I'm Jesse Zurawell, your host for the rest of the hour, and I've been speaking with Cynthia Chung, who recently published an excellent piece at Strategic Culture Foundation titled How the Ukrainian Nationalist Movement Post-World War II Was Bought and Paid For by the CIA. And just before the break, we left off with the formation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN, and the split that occurred between them in 1940 into the OUNB on the one hand, which was headed by Stepan Bandera, and OUNM on the other hand, which was led by Andriy Melnik. And in 1941, when the Nazis invaded, I believe it was the Ukrainian SSR, although Cynthia, you could correct me on that, the the OUN welcomed and readily collaborated with the Nazi invaders. So let's pick up there if we can.
Sure. Yeah, that's correct. And, to give people an idea of the kind of, I guess you can say, how the Western Ukrainians felt about this, the SS Galician Division, it was formed in 1943, April 1943, and it went on until April 1945, just like a few weeks before the Germans surrendered. And this division had overlap with OUN members. So basically they were coming in and out. And there wasn't like a disagreement, that you had to be a part of one or the other. And in just a month and a half, the SS Galician Division for the Nazis, right, Ukrainians fighting for the Nazis, recruited 80,000 volunteers in 1.5 months. So that's astounding. A high level of support. And the funny thing is, like, if you look at the flag of OUNB, right? So the flag of OUNM is the Ukraine colors with the trident and a sword in the center of the trident. So that is actually seen often, and I don't think a lot of people even realize, what that flag is associated with. And then OUNB is the blood and soil flag with the red on top and the black underneath. And the blood and soil is reference to the Nazi German slogan, the national body, blood united with the settlement area, soil. And the thing is
and I was just going to add quickly, sorry to cut you off again, but just to provide present day context, we see this symbolic split at work today as well. If you look at the Azov battalion's flag, it includes, among other things, the colors of the Ukrainian flag with the trident. Whereas if you look at the Pravi sector or right sector's flag, it has the blood and soil colors. I believe it has the trident in there as well, but there's still that symbolic split.
It does. Yeah. And but what's so, it just showcases, I guess, how much in denial they are of like that their bloodline is they really think it's like so superior compared to, I guess, any other Slav bloodline. And it also shows how they think of other Slavs, is that they use the blood and soil slogan of the Nazis, even though the Nazis had, General Plan Ost, which was, the plan to conquer and enslave the native Slavic and Baltic populations. And, Russia, like Stalin, was aware of this. This wasn't a secret, but the Western Ukrainians really just had it in their minds that they were going to be different. And so they collaborated with the Nazis. And, for those who think that Stefan Bandera was not a collaborator of the Nazis, he most certainly was, even though he was in prison for a lot of the war. When Germany came in, the OUNB basically on June 30th proclaimed the establishment of the Ukrainian state in the name of Bandera. Okay, so he always wanted it to be under his name. It wasn't just freedom for Ukrainians. It was always under Bandera rule, with Bandera. And as soon as he declared this Ukrainian state and he pledged loyalty to Hitler as well, he thought that he was going to be granted this for some reason. The Germans immediately arrested and imprisoned or killed outright about 1,500 people. And Stefan Bandera and his closest deputy, Yaroslav Stetsko, were put in Sachsenhausen, sorry for my pronunciation, concentration camp, but it's a relatively comfortable concentration camp. So it just goes to, it's complicated because there's like a lot of there's fighting between the Nazis. Sometimes you're collaborating with them, sometimes you're working with them, and then there's even infighting within the OUN. Not just even with the split between the OUN OUM and the OUNB, but the UPA, which is the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which is also basically it's the paramilitary unit of OUN. There was also other leaders apparently that had formed this army, and Mykola Lebed, he was able to avoid imprisonment by the Nazis when this Ukrainian state was announced by Bandera, and he took over the OUNB leadership. And it's been claimed by Ukrainians in the U.S. That Mykola Lebed gained control over the UPA by slaughtering the leadership. So that kind of gives you, again, there's no loyalty here. It's like, whatever for like power grab, largely.
Yes, absolutely.
So the Germans, like Mykola Lebed, he's very much like wanted to show the world that he was never a Nazi collaborator, because the German security police did issue a wanted poster with Lebed's photograph, and he carried around it with him for the rest of his life in the United States to prove he never worked with the Nazis. But if you look at the declassified material, because in 1998 there was a massive declassification, the largest congressionally mandated declassification effort in history, which focused on the Nazi war crimes and Japanese imperial government records. And it shows very clearly through using these records, and also, Hoover from the FBI had also gained access to some of the German classified material, that Mykola Lebed very clearly did work with the Nazis, even though there was fighting between the two groupings. And people should again remember the SS Galician Division, which was basically controlled by the OUN largely. They worked for the Nazis, but that existed from 1943 until just a few weeks before the Germans surrendered. I have a lot of quotes in the article for people who want to get more detail in terms of, how these groupings actually, they basically exterminated the Poles, the Jews, any ethnic grouping that was not Ukrainian was like, kind of considered a target pretty much, and also fellow Ukrainians. Ukrainians that didn't agree with this agenda, which you see in Ukraine happening today. There are Ukrainians who are being attacked by these Ukrainian extremists who are not supportive of this radical agenda. And then you had, on top of all of this, infighting between the OUN membership and factions, like units of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. So it was really not how they, are trying to romanticize it today, that it was just like a movement of the people. And by September 1944, interestingly, the Germans decide to release Bandera and Stetsko from Sachsenhausen. I don't know why. And I think I'm just going to read something quickly too, just to get people to, a lot of the material I use in this article, I get from the work of US intelligence and the Nazis, which was a research group they basically went through this massive database of declassified material. And what they found was, one section they write, in September 1944, German army officers in northern Ukraine. So this is quite, late into the war. These officers in northern Ukraine told their superiors in the foreign armies east that the UPA was a, quote, natural ally of Germany, end quote, and, quote, a valuable aid for the German high command, end quote. And Himmler himself authorized intensified contacts with UPA. In addition, they write, though UPA propaganda emphasized that organization's independence from the German Nazis, the UPA also ordered some young Ukrainians to volunteer for the Ukrainian SS Division, Galicia, and the rest to fight by guerrilla methods. Mykola Lebed still hoped for recognition from the Germans because they knew that they would still need to have some kind of superpower to help protect them against the Russians. And they were still hoping that somehow the Germans were going to recognize some kind of independence for them, even after, how they reacted the first time around with Stefan Bandera declaring a Ukrainian state.
Right. And it seems too that in September 1944 that the Nazis may have been seeing the writing on the wall, which is why they were so keen, why Himmler was so keen to enhance the partnership with the UPA. Yeah,
they were going to be a buffer.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, again, it was never to give them independence, but it's like, yes, if the Russians start rushing in, well, yeah, better that the Ukrainians fight on the front line first, right? So by
very similar to what we're seeing today with Western Empire, militarily led by NATO, being willing to fight and die in Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. Of course, no Western Empire or NATO troops are going to be sacrificed in this slaughter. It's going to be Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so by 1944, the Supreme Ukrainian Liberation Council is formed, and this is supposed to be an underground government in opposition to the Ukrainian SSR. And it's Mykola Lebed is a major player in this, Stefan Bandera, Stetsko, and this other guy, Hriniak. And again, of course, by 1947, there's again conflict between Bandera and Stetsko and versus Lebed and Hriniak. And part of it is that Bandera just wants to be in charge. He wants to basically be a dictator. Not that Lebed is a great person either. Lebed was responsible for crazy war crimes during World War II. Like, he was responsible for the most grotesque level of ethnic cleansing, and also they committed a lot of torture and mutilation that was on par with what the Nazis and the Japanese fascists were doing. They tortured and mutilated people for not even for science. So, in their case, not that the Nazis and Japanese were doing that for science, but so
right. And there's reference made to the infamous Japanese contingent,
Unit
if you will.
731, yeah.
Yes.
Right, which the Americans, after World War II, the Americans transported all of those people to work in the United States. They never went to prison.
Right. Which we're about to get into here with Lebed in particular.
Right. And so Bandera still had a lot of control over this alternate underground government, but Lebed at this point starts to be recognized as the leader of it from the Western counterparts, and he, has a list of names, and he wants to give it to the Americans and all of this, and so they start to look at him as an asset, and so by then he starts to really start cleaning up. This is, I think, where a lot of the Ukrainians are using this alternate dimension history where, the OUN never worked with the Nazis and they never killed slaughtered Jews and things like this, because Lebed is the one who rewrote this history with his own little booklet, 126-page booklet, and it was the Army intelligence which considered Lebed's account of this history the complete background on the subject. And so
I laughed out loud when I read that.
Yeah, any other reality is not to be looked at. And this Gestapo wanted poster for Lebed was apparently all the proof that they needed that he was fighting against the Nazis, and we don't need to hear anything about that. Even though you have the Immigration and Naturalization Service who's starting to investigate him, saying this guy is especially bad compared to the Nazis we're letting in. We're going to probably deport him and all this sort of stuff. And it's the CIA who is stepping in and, basically saying that Lebed is clean. We're gonna continue with him, and we're gonna make him a naturalized citizen. Alan Dulles wanted him to have free, access to travel to Western Europe whenever he wanted, and back to the United States. And there's documentation of this. I have it also within the paper. And at a certain point, the CIA, the British intelligence originally was supporting Bandera, but eventually they start to side with the CIA that Lebed is their guy. And they're actually putting pressure on Bandera, who is in Munich at the time, who's also under a certain protection from the West, who is running the oppositional government from there. They want Bandera to step down and for Lebed to be the guy. And Bandera is conveniently assassinated in 1959, which they say is by KGB, but I suspect it was not KGB, and it was really, and it's very odd because there's so much in the declassified material by the CIA saying, like, we can't kill Bandera, we would make him a messiah, and there's like just a lot of references to like we can't kill him and everything, and it's like obviously what better way to say that the Russians killed Bandera to seal the heroism of Bandera for the Ukrainians, and they will forever hate the Russians for killing him, when in fact it was likely his Western handlers at that point.
And so, he became a disposal problem, to use the more modern geopolitical parlance. Way that
was willing to play along with the game, right? And he was willing to be kind of like the Americans' pawn, so that he could have certain still influences and power and so forth. But Bandera did believe, I think more in the fantasy that he had created for himself, whereas Lebed, I don't think really believed in a lot of it at the end of the day, and was probably just a psychopath. But if the CIA likes those types of people who will listen to orders to a certain extent, but are psychopaths. Those are the golden nuggets. And so the CIA basically, for people also to realize Lebed being sent into Western Europe, it was because by 1947, about 250,000 Ukrainians, moved to Germany, Austria, Italy. Many of them were OUN activists or sympathizers. So it was the radicals who went to Western Europe, obviously, because they're afraid of the Russians for good reason. They want Lebed to start reorganizing these extremist groups. The CIA was encouraging this activity to continue, even though they were not the originators of it. And what's very, very clear is that Lebed becomes selected as the CIA's chief contact advisor for aerodynamic. And at first, aerodynamic was supposed to be, and this is again through Alan Dulles' Office of Policy Coordination, his rogue faction for covert operations. They were supposed to be doing guerrilla actions to fight the Soviets, but they ended up losing. And eventually, by 1953, aerodynamic, and the Ukrainian insurgent army, they existed until 1956. So they were also fighting the Soviets up until then. By 1953, aerodynamic is more turned into a Ukrainian study group under Lebed's leadership, with CIA, control, and they basically start reforming Ukrainian literature and history. And they are producing this propaganda of like OUN radical, interpretation of everything into the newspapers, the bulletins, the radio programming in Ukraine. And
disseminating it not just from places like Poland, but also from South America as well, through this Prologue Research and Publishing Association.
Exactly.
Which was essentially set up as a business by the CIA, which is obviously illegal. The CIA has no business setting up businesses, but
there's so much going on here.
Right. When is the CIA concerned with legality?
Yeah. Exactly. It's through this Prologue Research and Publishing Association. Later on, I think it's called Prologue Research Corporation. And it's through Riniak and Lebed. Riniak is running this through the Munich office. And again, Reinhard Gehlen, he was a sort of leading Nazi, not really, but he was big enough in the surveillance of Nazi Germany, and he got the golden ticket, and he became in charge of West Germany's security and surveillance. Of course, why not, right? Makes perfect sense, which would form the German security and police apparatus later on. Like the Gehlen organization was what would form what is now, even today, like the bedrock for security for West Germany.
It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah, and so Prologue recruited and paid Ukrainian immigrant writers. Most of them were not aware that they were working for the CIA, which I suspect is what's going on probably too in the West today. And then this propaganda, if you had the right thoughts, right, you were allowed this, because not all Ukrainians thought this way.
Right.
But and that's another
just as
thing
is the
people
case
should
today.
be aware of. Yeah, there's Eastern Ukraine is very different from Western Ukraine, and I even was speaking to someone who her grandparents, I think, came from Odessa, and she, even though she was born here, she always thought of herself as Russian, even though, Odessa is technically a part of Ukraine because they were, there during the Soviet rule. And in her retelling of her grandparents' experience, it was not a negative experience, right? And it's not a lot. That's going to be the case for a lot of Ukrainians. And that's why there's a civil war going on in Ukraine, which the West never calls it that, but it's been like a civil war for the last 8 years. And the reason why this has been occurring is completely like the Americans have such a direct hand in this because they've been pushing all of this propaganda that was organized by Lebed to continue radicalizing as many Ukrainians as they could while the Soviet Union was still under control of Ukraine. And then as soon as Ukraine becomes independent, you have neo-Nazi groups that form right away. You already have pushes to start re-romanticizing in a very public manner people like Stefan Bandera. And then by the time you have the Maidan coup, the Americans are like on the ground training these neo-Nazi groupings and encouraging people to join these neo-Nazi groupings for the last 8 years. So, and then you have a whole section of Eastern Ukraine who are ethnic Russians. So they speak Russian and they're ethnic Russian. And in Crimea, that's the case where it's mostly ethnic Russians and they speak Russian. And that's why they were very scared and they voted to join Russia when they saw the kind of craziness that was happening in 2014. And people should be aware that the Ukrainian government has been withholding 85% of the water to Crimea for the last 8 years. And when the Russians came in, they corrected that. But that's a humanitarian crisis. And of course, what do you hear in the West? That the Crimeans never chose to go to Russia, and you never hear, about the water being withheld and things like that.
Or the genocide that's been carried out for the past 8+ years against the people of Donbass. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think that we did a really good job of bringing that history up to the present. And I thank you very much for writing this piece and also for taking the time to speak with me today to dig into it. And I hope we can have another conversation soon. Cynthia, Chung, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too. Bye.